Thank you for being here.
Yeah, of course.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your name? Where were you born? And where did you grow up?
So my name is Kendra Duli. I was born in Albania, in Tirana, Albania, in the capital city. And I grew up between my grandparents' neighborhood and my parents' neighborhood. My parents' neighborhood was in the more affluent part of town, and then my grandparents' neighborhood was near the hospital area. So I would just be spending a lot of my childhood back and forth there. And then I moved to New York City when I was 14 with my family. And I went to an early college high school in Manhattan, and I graduated with an AA degree from there. And now I'm studying at American University in Washington, D.C.
Wow. So why specifically did your family decide to move from Albania to New York, or why specifically like to the United States?
Well, I think with a lot of seeing like the economy and opportunities in the US, it would be just a better sort of spot to be in rather than in Europe. In Europe, it's like we've kind of been seeing more degradation in general. So that's why the US was a better place to live overall. And so we were kind of just hoping for a more open culture towards other people. We were kind of hoping that we would be surrounded by a community where we didn't get discriminated against, because there is discrimination against Albanians in Europe to a certain extent. And so that was like something that we considered. I have a lot of family living in Italy. We've had some family live in Greece for periods of time, in the UK and all of that. And there is some like, there is some and the economic opportunities aren't as good in those places anymore. So there's that. And we also moved here for my education quite a bit. It was like one of the driving factors, because the education quality back home wasn't too great. My mom was a professor in university, and she kind of saw how everything was like kind of falling apart. So that's why we moved here, because my mom wanted me to have a higher quality of education, which I have experienced, thankfully.
We've heard that there is a large Albanian community, specifically in New York. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Build off of it a
Yeah.
little?
Yeah, of course. I've been working with it quite a bit. I've done volunteering, and I've done like actual work for them as well. So we are in all the boroughs. There is a large concentration in the Bronx. And then you also you have a lot of Albanians in Queens, and then Staten Island, you have a bit more affluent Albanians, not necessarily, but it's just something I've noticed. Brooklyn has a bit around the Bay Ridge area. Manhattan is actually probably the rarest, but there's the Albanian consulate there. And there are a lot of Albanian American organizations. One of the most prominent ones is Vatra, which has been here since the beginning of Albanian independence and all of that. And there are other organizations that go on. We have had people running for politicians of Albanian descent. A lot of them are Albanians that have been stuck outside of Albanian borders as well. So Albanians from Kosovo, from Montenegro, from North Macedonia, and all of that. So you'd see a lot of that community. There's events that are hosted. There are Albanian American restaurants and shops and all of that, especially around the Little Italy area in the Bronx. There is a lot of the shops are actually Albanian owned or Albanian run, especially the Italian ones. I think our diaspora is trying to get to be able to actually vote in Albanian elections too, which is kind of exciting. Due to there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of corruption that goes on in our country, and so we think that by being able to vote more freely in the US, we might be able to have like choosing better candidates. So there is Albanian political parties that are forming for the diaspora to vote in our countries. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cultural events. There's also an Albanian church in upstate New York, Our Lady of Shkodra, which is good. And there's also an Albanian mosque in Staten Island. So there's a lot of community events and a lot of community spots for people to join. And there's a lot of Albanian schools as well, which they teach Albanian kids how to like speak Albanian and be able to speak with their grandparents and write and all of that. So yeah, I think that's kind of like the overview. There's more to it, of course. There's dance groups and all of that, but this is kind of like the overview.
It's great to hear how involved you are within your community. We've seen that like you volunteered in Alba Life and Albanian Roots. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in these organizations and a story or two?
Yeah, of course. So I'll start off with Alba Life, which is where I started off at. I was my mom also kind of taught there as well, so I was helping her out at first with like lesson plans and all of that. I kind of understand a bit more about like Albanian like young people or kids and all of that as a young person myself, so I was able to relate to the kids a little more and just same like kind of help my mom out in that sense. And then later on, I assisted in person from online to like in-person teaching. And I also did journalism work for them because they're also a TV station. And I interviewed some prominent figures. I interviewed the Albanian ambassador, Floreta Faber at the time. I interviewed the Albanian representative in the UN, Ferid Hoxha. It was during the time when the Ukraine war started. So Albania was kind of head of the Security Council and they were doing like this joint resolution with the United States. So that was I didn't get the interviews were supposed to be like on the shorter end because I would do them at Albanian events. We had a lot of streets that were like getting like Albanian, like that were being named after Albanian figures in New York City. So, like for example, Skanderbeg Way, or in Staten Island there was Ismail Jamali Way, which I got to interview the Staten Island Borough President and all of these other community leaders who worked with the Albanian community in Kosovo and Albania, but also in New York City. I got to interview the mayor of Kosovo, of Pristina, Kosovo, which was pretty interesting. And then later on with Albanian Roots, this is still something I'm sort of working on, and I'm still working with them. But I help them out with the Albanian Parade, which happens every June every year, and it's been going on since the early 2000s, I want to say. And so it's this year, I think they had the 15th anniversary, and we had a gala and all of that, and we had a lot of prominent figures invited to that. So we had the parade going on, which I helped out with. And then right now I'm trying to start an Albanian club here at American University and trying to join with Albanian Roots on that. So they do a lot of things for the community as well. That's like the brief overview of some things I've done.
Okay, so I have a few questions based on everything you just talked about. So when you were talking about like trying to get Albanian Americans or Albanians that are living in the United States the ability to vote in Albanian elections, that made me really excited because when I was still at American University, just to preface this for the interview for anybody who's watching, I used to attend American University, the same university as Kendra. I went there for a year and a half and I was studying international studies in SIS, the School of International Service. And I was an Olson Scholar, my last semester there, which is like an intensive research program. And I was researching homeland development. So when people emigrate from less developed countries to more in terms of like democratization and stuff like that, to more democratized countries. So I was trying to look specifically at the Balkan region. So it made me really excited when you were talking about like the ability to vote in homeland elections, because that was something that I was looking at, like which diasporas are able to do that when they are living in more democratized countries and how that influences homeland development. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. What do you think about like the ability of the Albanian diaspora or diaspora members in general to influence like homeland development in terms of politics, or whether it's like socioculturally?
Well, it's a very complex issue and there's a very huge debate on that. The movement has like literally just started, like I want to say around, like it's been definitely something people have been wanting to do for years, but I think any sort of tangible coalitions and people coming together, this has been starting more so this year as far as I've heard of, or like in the past few years, and it's still in the developing stages. There is support for it, and a lot of I did some interviews for this project I was doing about brain drain, and some of the people I was talking with thought it would be best to have people from that diaspora voting because they would be less likely to be corrupted. As you know, there's a lot of election fraud that goes on in the Balkans and all of that, and in Albania that is kind of commonplace. So with like people living abroad, there is this assumption that they're doing better financially and are more affluent, so they would be able to be less biased in their voting. But there's a lot of concerns, and there is both political sides kind of are like, very iffy about it. The current leadership, let's just say they would want to corrupt like the vote if they want to do that, because they do control electoral systems. If people voted more freely and didn't vote for them, that would not necessarily be in their favor. But I've also heard the argument that, they could, since they technically control more of the electoral system, since they are in the majority, like people would be able to, it would be able to just change those ballots as they come to Albania so that technically it would be more votes for them, which is why the opposition sort of does oppose it. But at the same time, it's a complex issue. It's the idea that the system needs to not be corruptible. So if votes are coming from, the diaspora, we don't want those ballots to be tampered with. That's like the biggest issue with that. But also there is the other argument, which a lot of the majority that is leading the country makes, is that, the diaspora doesn't live here anymore. So how can they like influence like current elections and living standards and make decisions? Like, that's not exactly, because you don't live here. And a lot of the diaspora has, like, there's some diaspora that's been here for 20 years that have come here since the early 2000s and 90s, and Albania has changed a lot since then. So there is that sort of impact as well to think about in terms of if the diaspora should even vote. Those are some of the questions that's been going on. But it is also a positive movement because, presumably people would have more freedom people in diaspora would have more freedom of choice and votes because they don't necessarily have the same struggles as they do in Albania.
Yeah, that, like, those different viewpoints on that issue are really interesting. I mean, I guess it like also bears the question like about retaining connections, like transnational networks between the United States or wherever there's an Albanian community and then Albania itself, like how long that you're away like from Albania, and then things obviously are changing there, whether it's like culturally, politically, so then you're like detached from that. So then I guess it bears the question of like how long do you have to be away before, like, I don't know, you're a little bit more detached, or like those transnational networks, like how do we keep them strong? Should they be strong? Like, should people be able to vote? So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. And I've noticed with a lot of Albanians here that have been living for a long time, like, they aren't necessarily the most up to date with things. And even I've noticed with myself, which I'm very involved in the community and all of that, like even I sometimes feel like I'm losing touch with certain things because I've been here for 4 years. And, I didn't go through the pandemic in Albania. I went through the pandemic in the US, and the way that things were handled was differently. And it's one thing to hear about it from friends and family. It's another thing to experience it. And I've noticed that with a lot of Albanians, they're kind of like, well, I think this could apply to anyone, but Albanians that have been here for a long time, for 20 years or more, some of them are stuck in the same mindset as like Albania in the early 2000s or in the 90s. Not necessarily, but there are people who do get stuck in time, and that's a concern that definitely should be something to notice. I'm not saying everyone is like that, and I'm not generalizing it, but it's something I've noticed with certain people are definitely stuck in a mindset that Albania is not necessarily in anymore, because there has been progress. There has also not been progress at the same time. So there are things that have been the same, but there has also been some progress that has not necessarily translated to people who have left before that could happen. I was also just thinking about being away, like for so long, you kind of don't have as many friendships there anymore, or like you might have some family, but a lot of people, especially if they're gone for a really long time, they don't necessarily have those work connections, especially if they left really young. They don't have professional kind of background a lot of the times. They don't have Albanian professional background. They have American professional background, but it's not it's not the same. Sometimes things are done very differently. And then if you're born here and you weren't even born there, there's obviously that sort of dissonance that you have.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that point you bring up about people that left in the early 2000s. There's still some of them are still stuck in that mindset. I mean, in my like my experience, my dad left the former Yugoslavia in 1998, and then like we went back for the first time 17 years after he left, so in 2015. And I mean, like the way he talks to family that are still living there, that are back home, they like his cousin, one of his cousins, because I've gone back more than he's gone back, she'll always joke with me, oh, your father still thinks that we exist in 1998. Like we're still in the past century. He's left. He's lived like 25 years of life, but we're still in 1998 because he just can't believe like that, like that that a lot of the things that we have in the United States that they have there now, because it's like you're trapped in a moment of time in a way. It's hard like when you leave your country and then like a lot has changed, but I guess like you're just trapped in that moment when you left.
Yeah, exactly. That's been something that people have been experiencing. And then there's people who haven't even visited Albania before that've been born in the US, because I have a lot of Albanian American friends that were born here and just have never visited. And so all they really know about Albania is stuff they see during their own research, which I'm not gonna lie, we don't have a lot of as much information as there should be. And there is also, and just things they've heard from their parents or family or something like that. And it's not the same thing as living there. And they don't have that sort of, you know, they don't necessarily have the full connection. They do want to, and they crave it. A lot of people, especially if you're born here, like a lot of people become much more nationalistic, for one, I've noticed, as they moved, as they like, you know, because they want to be connected to that culture. But with people that have moved more recently, they're less likely to be that nationalistic. And I've noticed, especially with young Americans, young Albanian Americans in New York City, I've noticed that they've sort of, there's also there a little bit of a culture that's starting to form, an Albanian American culture. It's pretty much, I would say this isn't necessarily 100% true, but I'd say in New York City, it's more prominent, more Albanians are like, there's a higher percentage, I guess, of Albanians from Kosovo and Northern Albania. So I think it's more influenced because of that. Like a lot of the restaurants there are that are Albanian are Northern Albanian or Northern Albanian owned. Not necessarily 100%. There's definitely Southern Albanian there too, but a lot of my friends are Northern Albanian, so a lot of the culture influence is there. We're still like, we're one nation, and we are like obviously the same people and all that. I'm just talking more about like regional sort of, you know, like influences, because like even within one small region, like there is like smaller regions all in all, because Albania is a pretty diverse in that regional sense. So that's like what I'm referring to.
Yeah, I think across diaspora groups, across the ethnic groups, there are tendencies for some of the people born in the United States to develop those nationalistic tendencies, just because they think that's the best way to like prove that they are what they are. I've noticed it in the Serbian diaspora. Like you have to be, if you're not like the most extreme, like even though you don't know any, like you don't know a lot of the history, you don't know a lot, like you don't know a lot of stuff, like as long as you're like saying like, oh, I'm so proud, like, and then you're nationalistic, that's okay. But it can be very negative, obviously. And yeah, about like those different, I guess, groups that are forming, like those that are developing their own subculture. I think the development of the subcultures is really interesting. I was just at the Greek festival in Arizona this past weekend, and there's definitely, I've noticed, because I've been involved in like the Greek diaspora, even though I'm not Greek, I know a lot of people from the Greek diaspora, and I've noticed like this Greek American culture form, and it's really interesting to see. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, so you said that you're trying to start an Albanian student organization at American University, which I think is amazing. While I was at American University, I worked with somebody to start the Student Association for Slavic Studies, because we noticed a lack of community for those that are interested in Slavic studies and those of Slavic descent. So I think it's really amazing that you're starting with that. So you're starting that for the Albanian community at American University. So I wanted to ask you, so you've been at American University for a few months now. What is the Albanian or Balkan population like? I haven't been there in a few years, so I wanted to ask you about that and how it's going starting that student organization.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack with that, but since you mentioned like the Slavic organization, I do want to say that there is a club here now at American that is like a Slavic association going on.
Yes, my friend and I started that.
Which I'm really happy about that. I heard that they would be bringing in ambassadors and all of that and having like cultural events. So, I mean, I was considering that if there wasn't any sort of club, I was considering that. But an Albanian club, there used to be an Albanian club here, but then it sort of dissolved. And me and two other girls, they're in junior year, were like, I met them through a mutual friend, and we are kind of just trying to start something up. And as for the Albanian population here at American, I would say that it's not very big at American University. There is Albanians here, which I'm aware of, but it's not that many.
So how do you share your culture with people who may not know as much about Albania or the Balkans?
Well, I start from scratch a lot of the times because a lot of people don't know much about Albania. So I will tell them everything there is to know about it. It depends on how curious they are. I'll tell them, I'll start by pointing at a map. I'm big into geography and all of that. So I will point at a map. I'll start like explaining to them this is where I lived and all of that. And I will just take any questions. I love talking about Albania and I love telling people about it.
What do you think about the Balkan diaspora and building peace in America?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult task because sometimes I notice that there is animosity between the Balkan countries. There's a lot of history that goes with that. So, I'll hear a lot of negative things being spewed about each other. But I do also notice that because we're all from the Balkans, like there is some sort of connection and similarity that we have. So for example, like I have some friends that are like from Croatia or Serbia and all of that, even though I'm Albanian. And technically, if we were like in the Balkans, it would be less likely to get along. But here we kind of just get along.
So based on exactly what you just said, do you have any advice for the Balkan diaspora on preserving our culture while living in America?
Well, it's important to get organized. I think that's the main thing, to not like be divided amongst your own, like to be divided amongst yourselves, because I noticed that there is division even within like the Albanian community, let alone with like adding into that other ethnic groups within the Balkans. So just having that sort of like putting aside those differences, which might be hard, and there's definitely like history behind that as well, but putting aside a lot of those differences is going to be key to being able to collaborate and to come and to be able to be peaceful and to develop and evolve and to also preserve our culture.
When I was doing research in Olson Scholars, I noticed like the lack of data on like the Balkan diasporas in the United States. That was a really big issue. I was emailing embassies and saying, like embassies that are in the United States, I was asking, do you have data on how many people are from the Montenegrin diaspora in the United States, Bosnian diaspora? And there's just no data. But for so many other groups, I guess maybe ones that have a longer history in the United States, like there's a lot more data on the Armenian diaspora, for example. That was something I noticed a lot. So I just wanted to touch on that. And that's another reason, like what we're doing with Balkan in America, why it was started, to collect data qualitatively, these interviews, by sharing people's stories, and touching on what you said about like how people are divided. I think it's important for us to have conversations like this with people across ethnic lines to, have these conversations, break down barriers. So that's a big goal of what we're trying to do, as well as collect data to share on our website.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're doing that, because this is a problem that I've noticed too, that there isn't like exact numbers. and it feels like we're smaller in terms of size too, especially with Albanians, because I noticed, for example, when I was working in political campaigns, they do have like ethnic filters and all of that, and I noticed I was trying to find Albanian and all of that, and it wasn't there. They had Yugoslav, which was pretty new addition, but they didn't have Albanian. So that was something that I noticed. They don't really have data. That's completely true. And I think also like our research institutions back home, they also don't have a lot of information either. Like a lot of the times, like there is a lack of academic qualitative data, and there is a lack of academic discussion. Like it's not in the near level that is in the US, where there's a lot of discussions about important topics. A lot of in Albania, like people are very passionate, and they will have discussions like this. They will talk about politics, they will talk about culture, they'll talk about geography all day and all night. And so there is definitely some sort of interest in talking about intellectual and being intellectual, but that never really materializes into like anything tangible, because a lot of people don't have those resources and don't have that sort of structural or organizational background like they do here in the US. So there's also like lack of data coming from back home. So a lot of my research turned it out to be very qualitative instead of quantitative. And I based it a lot off of like people's personal experiences and interviews, rather than, I did have quantitative data and all of that, but it was from like these international organizations who would sometimes come in, and there's a lot of like, there's a lot of tampering sometimes, and there's a lot of there's a lot of lack of cultural context in some cases, and you don't get to hear much from government sources as much.
Yeah, I think it's probably up to our generation to collect that data, especially for those of us that are really like, we want to show how many of us there are. We want to keep those connections alive. We're trying to preserve and sustain our cultural heritage as well. So I think it's probably up to our generation and future generations to do that. And I'm excited to see where this goes with us, like keeping our cultures alive, as well as showing that we do have a strong presence in the United States, and that we have influence, we have power.
So one thing that I have also noticed, since you mentioned the whole generational, is that a lot of generations also seem to be kind of burned in a way, because you like a lot of the Yugoslav wars were pretty recent in the 90s and all of that. So a lot of people from older generations, kind of, especially those with technical skills, because they moved older, they didn't have necessarily the chance to be educated in the United States. And when you're not educated in the United States, that is kind of a barrier to entering the workforce, and then, or to entering like high paying positions in the workforce specifically. And also, this is more specific to Albanians, but a lot of them moved as like, there's also Albanians who moved as millennials, and with the millennials, they were kind of like, they did have their education, but they had it in Albania. So they also didn't necessarily get the chance to be educated in the US, because they moved like later in like the early 2010s. Not all, this doesn't apply to everyone, but this is applied to a lot of people. So there is that sort of burnt generation who do have professional and intellectual skills, but they don't have them with an American context. So it makes it harder to integrate. But with Gen Z, because we've moved younger here, we have the chance to be educated here and have that sort of cultural context. So I feel like we aren't completely burned, and we have that sort of ability to be able to get those like higher sort of paying jobs and positions and places of influence.
Did you say, are you a freshman? Or what year?
Yeah, I'm a freshman, but I did high school in the US and an early college, so I'm trying to graduate earlier. So I might be graduating in like 2.5 years, I want to say, hopefully. Not necessarily. It's more of a hope than 100%. It's not like certain, but I'm trying to graduate earlier.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, it's incredible to hear like how involved you are in your community and like the things that you've already achieved. And it was really good to hear, like amazing to hear like your story and like to like again hear like how huge of an impact you've had on your community and your diaspora.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do it with a lot of love, and I love my community, and I found a lot of happiness from this sort of work. So that's kind of why I do it. It just keeps me going in a way.